Alright, so for my creative project, I'm going to be sitting down talking about which two characters are my favorite and my least favorite from the novel. Um, I kind of feel like sit down and talk is just appropriate, and it's kind of what I need after a night of partying and drinking water. So, starting off with what character I like from the novel. There's not many, but Nick Carraway stands out to me the most because at first he seemed like the most average and boring man, like just like the stereotypical coming to New York to see what's up with life and trying to get some insight. A story that I've seen done many times before, but what I didn't expect was, and it was kind of similar as well in the movie, and I didn't really pick up on his character until watching the movie. Like, visually was easier to understand than like reading it. Yeah, since I'm referencing the novel, I'll say you see where Nick's character really comes into play because if we look at when Gatsby's first meeting with Daisy occurs in the comfy little cozy house with the little tea party, and it's raining outside, Gatsby's having a breakdown. At this point, Nick isn't like that familiar with Gatsby. He does everything in his power to help Gatsby, and I think that's very admirable. And that's I like that. That moment, I was like, okay, Nick's a good guy. I don't think I have to worry about him because reading the book, I was a little skeptical of everyone waiting for someone to betray someone. But Nick's truly a good guy because he helps Gatsby and he wingmans him, and that's just a quality I find really good. And he's loyal, and I'll go into that now. Towards the end of the book, you have Daisy and Tom and that other lady. I believe her name is Myrtle. It's not really relevant to what my point. You have the three, and they're all like, "Oh, Nick, come in, come in. Just forget about Gatsby. Let's just have a good night." Towards the end of the book, Nick gets very like fed up with Daisy and Tom, with all of the accusations about the driving and whatnot. And I know at one point they invite him in, and Daisy forgets about Gatsby and everything he's done for her. And Nick, at this point, is completely fed up. He realizes that these people that were kind to him at first and are still continuing to be kind, that doesn't make them good people. Towards the end of the book, I know that Nick gets invited into Daisy and Tom's house, and despite them being kind to them, Nick is able to pick up on the fact with the reader that these aren't good people anymore that we thought. Like, we all knew Tom wasn't a good person, and believe me, I will be going into Tom soon. But Daisy and is revealed to really just be a selfish, pretty much a backstabber with what she does to Gatsby and completely forgets about him and essentially just leads him on knowing that she has no real loyalty to him. And she shows that at the end when Gatsby is killed and she completely lives her life as if Gatsby never existed, as she did the past few years as well. And I think that is a real testament to how awful Daisy's character is and how good of a character Nick is for picking up on that and being like, whoa, hang on, you guys aren't good people, I'm out of here. And at the very end, he leaves to see Gatsby because he realizes that is my true friend who's been there for him. So, he realizes that Gatsby is really the only guy worth caring about that he's met so far. Because Gatsby is kind, he's caring, and he really is just in my opinion, in my analysis of him that I did in the creative writing assignment, I came to the conclusion he was just a very tragic hero who couldn't let go of the past. And Nick spends this book trying to help Gatsby. So I really appreciate him and admire him as a character for that. And I know this book is called The Great Gatsby, but if it was called The Great Nick, well, it doesn't really roll off the tongue as much. I think that wouldn't be stretching it too much either. Alright, so now I'm going into the character of Tom and Daisy. I'm supposed to find one character I like and dislike. It's a tie between Daisy and Tom for who I dislike the most. Tom for more obvious reasons, and I'm going to talk less about this because we talked about it in class a lot too. He's pretty blatantly racist, although I think an argument can be made that a lot of people were, and that was just a subject to them being brainwashed by whatever people wanted to think at that time. Although I'm not really making any excuses for him. He's very insecure, he's abusive towards that girl he broke her face for just mentioning Daisy. Myrtle, I think her name was. It's irrelevant, but I think that Tom is much more obvious why I don't like him. The more interesting character I think to talk about is Daisy. I'm not sure if this is a popular opinion, but I despise Daisy for what she did to Gatsby emotionally. Gatsby truly cared for her, and she took that and just she kind of just threw it out the window, not once but twice. And I think "fool me once, shame on you; fool me twice, shame on me" thing could be applied here because the first time she left Gatsby, she made excuses for herself, and Gatsby was so blinded by love and what he wanted his story with the Daisy to be that he couldn't see the facts, despite Gatsby's constant staring at that green light by the end of Daisy's dock, just being hopeful. Unfortunately for him, it wasn't enough, and Daisy kind of just ignored all of Gatsby's hopefulness for her. See that towards the end of the book, and in the movie, I think it's done very, very well. Basically, Gatsby is waiting for a phone call. He hears a phone ringing, and then he dies. And then, before he dies, he says to himself, Daisy, because he thinks Daisy has finally called him and he can have some peace. After looking at who called him, we can see that it wasn't Daisy, and it was Nick. And, I don't know if this is really subtle, but I picked up on it. I think that the book and the movie were both telling us that Nick was the only one who was ever there for Gatsby. Despite what Gatsby may have thought, he knew Nick was there for him, but he thought Daisy was there for him too. Daisy didn't care about Gatsby. Gatsby did everything for her. He took the blame for her for the murder with the vehicle. He did so much for her. And in the end, Daisy just kind of moved on with her life, had kids with Tom. She never even called. And because of her confusion, it led her to lead Gatsby on, manipulate him, whether it was directly or indirectly. She completely controlled his life, despite what Gatsby may have thought. Gatsby thought, this is actually something I find interesting. Gatsby thought he was in control because he had the money, he threw the parties, and he would live just close enough to Daisy's house that he could see her in passing, but just far enough that she wouldn't see him. He thought he had control over everything, and he had this giant plan. He had no control. Daisy was manipulating him since day one. Most of it indirectly, but some of it directly, because everything Gatsby did was for Daisy. Not everything Daisy did was for Gatsby. Because Daisy never really cared as much for Gatsby, despite what she may have thought, her actions and the way she treated him by completely shutting him out towards the end show that Daisy never cared that much for Gatsby, and because she didn't care for him, she had so much control over him, because people want what they can't have, and Gatsby was obsessed with Daisy. He did everything for her, and because of this, Gatsby, no matter how much wealth, no matter how much money, he would never be in control. He would be unsuccessful in getting Daisy, but he would spend all his time trying to do so, and this ties back into our original question, does money buy happiness? It does not, and this story is really just a great way of explaining that. Okay, so now I will be giving my nice little short analysis of the Roaring Twenties. I know a lot were going on in that time, a lot more than I could fit into 5 minutes, but I'm going to do my best to be as concise as possible and go over everything I know to meet the criteria. Anyways, so one thing I want to talk about first was this is a time where America was changing. This is a time the Great War ended, the war to end all wars. Some people came back and found that they had no jobs at all, but for the most part, business was booming. Not for the veterans so much who had PTSD, and society at this point, they didn't really account for all the trauma that would come for all the men who came back from war. They kind of just expected them to go back into their daily lives and just continue living life, but this wasn't a possibility for a lot of these veterans who came back scarred emotionally, physically. Some were missing arms, legs, incapable to do the jobs they were doing before. And society did a really poor job of accounting for these people's disabilities. This is a mistake they learned from in the future after World War II. They made sure to correct this, but a lot of people lost their jobs. And the 20s weren't as great for them as they would have been for some other people. But business was booming at this point in time. Stereotypes were changing, specifically the women. They started to redefine what being a woman means and what being feminine means. And they did this in the way of cutting their hair short. Most famously, it was called the bob. It was when they cut their hair before your hair had to go all the way down. Whereas this hairstyle, Daisy's friend actually has it. A lot of people do. But it goes down here, and it kind of just hangs here like a middle part, almost, and it goes all the way down. And you had something called the flapper. It was a very changing time. But it wasn't just hairstyles, it was how they dressed. I believe they started to show their knees at this point, which was like a very big deal. at that time. Women would wear dresses that would go just a little bit above their knees, and people were freaking out about this. They started cursing, they started drinking, they started wearing makeup, doing all these things that were considered masculine and only for men at this time. And people were losing their mind. Like, their parents were terrified. And I think it's funny because that's just a pattern that seems to be repeated through history all the time. Another thing that I find interesting about the 20s was the prohibition on alcohol started so many things in the mafia crime world. And we see this in shows, in movies, in video games. We watch them, we see the 1920s gangsters that are walking around New York with their Italian accents, the trench coats and their hats, sneaking off booze, paying off cops. And I think this was a very interesting time period for that too, because I actually find the mafia to be a very interesting, not interesting in the way I would love to be a part of it, but I think it's interesting to learn about it, and the amount of respect that came into that life. And I watched this one guy on YouTube. He has very interesting stories. He was actually a mafia boss, and he explains how life would have been around that time because his parents were also mafia, and his parents would have been alive in the 1920s. He talks about how important respect was in that life, and how you would be so successful to get in, get rich, and then get out alive. And it's a very interesting perspective to hear. And one thing he talks about from the 20s, from stories that he heard from his grandfather, was that, and it wasn't just alcohol. I know they talk about, in The Great Gatsby, they talk about alcohol, but gasoline, they were able to exploit, I think, gas station prices. I don't remember quite how, but this was something very common in the 1920s. But in doing this, they were able to make so much money off this. I think at this time, accounting for inflation, it would have been making tens and hundreds of millions of dollars as a business. But yeah, you compare the 2020s with the 1920s, and you'll see that it was quite a different time. Like, the only similarity you have really was you had the flu going around in the 1920s, very similar to how you had COVID in the 2020s, which is something that is quite a bizarre coincidence, if you ask me. But in my opinion, I think the 1920s definitely more fun than 2020 so far. Would have loved to be a part of that big change in society and in Canadian and American history, specifically in America, really. But it would have been great to witness how quickly society was changing and how quickly people were ready to start accepting women as more as equals. That was really the start, I believe. And it would have been very, maybe, it would have been very interesting to see how life in the mafia would have looked like. And the fashion sense of the 1920s is definitely something worth exploring. For men, didn't change too much. You know, you had the little trench coats outside, and you had the very formal dress wear, jeans and the dress shirts, very common for men. Then for women, it would have been dresses again. They started going up to the knees, which was a very big deal at this time. And it would have been amazing to be a part of that big change, or even to witness it. And I think that's a part of what makes the 1920s so incredible. Anyways, that concludes my little sit down and talk session podcast with lots of money and lots of time. Luca, hosted by Luca, edited by Luca, all of that. And Hollywood was releasing over 800 films every year. Today, it's rare to have over 5